What's going on, friends? Welcome back to another New World video. Today we're going to be talking about the differences between tank, damage, and healer in New World Aeternum. As you level up in the game and unlock PvE activities such as expeditions, or even PvP activities such as Outpost Rush and 3v3 Arena, when you queue up you'll be asked, do you want to play as tank, damage, or healer? At today's video, we're going to be covering the main differences between these three different roles and what responsibilities are typically expected of you if you choose to play tank, damage, or healer, including what weapons you'll typically be running, what equip load or armor you'll be wearing, abilities, stats, all of that good stuff. The role of the healer, as you guys might have guessed it, is to heal. This is the role that I typically play the most. You are effectively a support, so you don't do a whole lot of damage usually, but of course you do have access to very powerful healing. The healer typically uses weapons like the Life Staff in conjunction with abilities like Sacred Ground in order to reduce incoming damage and top up the HP of their teammates. There are some discrepancies between the way this role plays in PvE, these are expeditions, versus PvP like Wars, Outpost Rush, and 3v3 Arena, but we'll get to those specifics later on. Healers typically play with light armor or in a light equip load, as this very importantly gives them the 30% outgoing healing buff. On top of that, most of their stats are usually assigned to focus, as this powers up the Life Staff, allowing it to do more healing. And typical weapon pairings for the healer include the Void Gauntlet, Rapier, or Flail. The role of damage in New World Aeternum, just like with healing, is pretty obvious. Your goal is to do damage. Damage players are typically looking to kill the enemy as fast and efficiently as possible. There are many different weapons that damage players use in New World Aeternum, and also their equip load in terms of light, medium, or heavy armor can vary quite a bit, and their attributes as well. But for a further deep dive, this really comes down to whether you are playing in PvP or PvE, whether you're playing solo or as a group, and whether you want to play melee or ranged damage or DPS. However, though, for more specifics on the damage role, scrub ahead in the video. We are going to have different sections for healer, damage, and tank to do a little bit more of a deep dive on each role and, what the typical expectations and responsibilities are. And last, but certainly not least, we have the role of tank. Tanks are very important in most forms of content, as they are there to effectively control the flow of combat. They are your front line, reducing incoming damage to themselves and your teammates. In PvE, such as expeditions, they use taunts, which deliberately force the enemy to attack them, allowing the DPS or damage players to move around more freely and not worry about taking damage themselves, and also make it easier for the healer to see where everybody is and keep everybody topped up. Tank players probably have the most responsibility out of anybody in your party, and they typically use weapons like Sword and Shield, Warhammer, Great Axe, Hatchet, lots of melee weapons. Tanks also usually play in heavy armor, with lots of points into constitution, strength, and sometimes dexterity. One of the aspects that makes a good tank is the use of CC, or crowd control. These are abilities that slow, stun, knock down, generally impair the enemy from moving or doing actions, performing spells in the first place. They are there, again, to reduce incoming damage, control the enemy, and just generally be a nuisance, be the front line effectively. Now, before we go into the deep dive into tank, damage, and healer, I do want to quickly address that the screen will look a little bit different here. This is because this is recorded on an older version of New World Aeternum, back when it was just called New World, but it is effectively still the same game. You can see the weapons are still the same, attributes pretty much still the same, but yeah, just wanted to address visually, the game will look slightly different, but effectively everything, all the information you're getting from this video will still be relevant for New World Aeternum, and probably onwards into 2025, 2026, and however long New World Aeternum goes for. And when it comes to the role of healer in New World Aeternum, it's important to note that unlike with tank and damage, you have to run one specific weapon. The reason behind this is because at time of recording, there is only one true dedicated healing weapon, and that is the Life Staff. So know that if you want to play as a healer in New World Aeternum, it is non-negotiable that you use the Life Staff weapon. A secondary weapon choice we'll get onto in a little bit, but the Life Staff is going to be the foundation of what makes as a healer in New World Aeternum. In PvE, which is player versus environment, these are your expeditions, mutated expeditions, trials, raids, so on and so forth. Basically, when you're fighting against AI, it's very common for healers to pair with a Void Gauntlet. The reason behind this is Void Gauntlet doesn't really offer that much in the way of movement, you know, escaping or getting away from the enemy, but since you're playing with a tank who has taunts, you can afford to take a bit more of a static or stationary weapon. The Void Gauntlet provides excellent buffs and debuffs to the enemy and buffs to your team, and it can also again add additional healing, more so than almost any other weapon in the game, with the exception of the flail, which is typically another choice that you might see healers go for. So life staff and flail, or life staff and Void Gauntlet, are going to be your go-to options as a healer in New World Aeternum for PvE. When it comes to PvP, it's quite common to see healers pair the rapier with the life staff. Now this is a bit of an unusual combo, because you would think, well, the rapier, are we using that to do damage? Are we trying to jab the enemy a lot? No, the reason behind this is the rapier offers a lot of escape options. So in PvP, you can't really do the same thing with the tank where you have taunts. You can't taunt the enemy to attack you. You can get in front of them and maybe call them nasty names and say things about their mother, but it's not going to be quite the same as a full-on taunt in PvE. So healers typically run a rapier in PvP, and that way if we have enemies coming in to try and kill us, to prevent us from healing the other people they're trying to kill, you can escape with the rapier through movement abilities such as flesh and evade. You can use riposte to reflect damage and put a stun onto the enemy, and just generally create some distance so then you can back off and go back to healing again. So Void Gauntlet, flail in PvE for the buffs, debuffs, the additional healing, and then rapier purely just for the movement. It's not there for damage, it's just there for its abilities. But that are the main discrepancies between weapon choice in PvE and PvP. For abilities and weapon mastery with the life staff, regardless of whether you're going into PvE or PvP, there are some basics that you'll pretty much always want to choose. The first one is the Sacred Ground ability. The reason behind this is the final upgrade for Sacred Ground Anointed increases the healing of all of your other abilities by 50%, and that's pretty good. There is no other buff in the game that increases healing by 50%. So taking Sacred Ground with the Anointed upgrade, it's something that you want to do, again, for every build. It's just a must-have. In order to get to Anointed, you'll probably want to pick up one of these passives to the left or right, Revitalize or Desperate Speed. I'm going to recommend you go for both of them because they both give you good cooldown reduction, which means you can use your abilities more often, which means you can heal more often. So this is going to be the foundation that will make up almost all of our builds with the life staff in New World Aeternum. Some other upgrades that I recommend you take for your builds include Blissful Touch. This is a passive that allows your light attacks to heal people when it passes through them. 16% weapon damage is not too bad. That's the same amount that Sacred Ground heals per second, and Beacon as well. So Blissful Touch, again, I would say almost a must-have. Sacred Protection is a passive that increases the healing of you and your allies by 10% as long as you have the life staff in your hand. So again, extra incoming healing, always good. And then finally on the right side, Bend Light is, it says after you dodge, your outgoing healing is 20% more effective for 5 seconds. So as long as you can dodge once every 5 seconds, you'll get 20% more outgoing healing, which is a solid upgrade. And then finally, we want to pick up Protector's Strength, which says if you have a buff, and this down here does count as a buff, by the way, all outgoing healing is 20% stronger. So again, another 20% increase to healing. So we got 20% here, 20% here, 50% here. It all stacks up very, very strong and allows your healing to be much, give you much bigger numbers effectively, and bigger number equals better. So yeah, these are the passives, and the way that we get to Protector's Strength is typically going to be through taking Beacon down to about here, and then we can pick up Protector's Strength, or we want to take Orb. When you do choose Orb, you want to go all the way down. Without the Aegis upgrade, Orb of Protection, quite frankly, is just not very good. But yeah, these are going to be the foundational. Again, ignore this. Imagine it's just highlighted, and I want to say that that is, you know, lock it in. That's what you want to be using all the time. And Protector's Strength is also included there, but I just don't want to say that you should always be using Protector's Touch. Now, with those auto includes out the way, your weapon mastery is going to look a little bit different depending on whether you are engaging in PvE, so like an expedition, or PvP, something like Outpost Rush. In PvE, it's very common for players to run all AoE healing, so something like this would be very commonplace. as a sort of starter build for healing in expeditions like Amrine, the Depths, Tempest Heart, etc. The reason behind that is because AoE healing is generally quite easy to pull off, and you don't really need that much in the way of single target. Unless your tank is very, very good at their job, it's usually going to be the case that multiple people are taking damage at the same time, especially when it comes to mutated expeditions, which are a harder form of the expeditions because they have like AoE damage, like fire on the ground, explosions, little void puddles, etc. So AoE healing is often needed. It's also very common in expeditions, especially in mutated expeditions at the higher levels, that people play with melee weapons as opposed to fire staff and bow, where you have ranges and wizards off to the side. Everybody's all stacked up on top of each other. So you have the tank right there, and then just behind him are all of the DPS players, you know, playing with the hatchet, playing with the greatsword, playing with the spear. And because they're all grouped up nicely together like that, you can hit them with all your heals at the same time. So you put the Sacred Ground on them first to increase the incoming healing, then hit them with the Orb and then the Beacon. You just have a nice big pocketed area of healing, and your melee players can all stand in that same area. However, if you are playing with friends or just random players that do prefer to play with the bow, or with the fire staff or a musket or something like that, you may want to consider changing your build up to include Splash of Light instead. So in this instance, for healing an expedition, I would rock a build that maybe looks a little bit something like this. We go with Splash of Light again because it's just a very easy heal to get out there. We take our other passives that we're interested in, and then we have the choice to go for Beacon and dropping it down to here. Typically you don't need the speed of light increase. Its movement speed is not that necessary in PvE. Or we could go for Orb of Protection over here. And as we mentioned earlier, you do want to make sure you fully upgrade Orb. The difference between these, I would say Orb is it's a shorter cooldown, but not as powerful as a heal, whereas Beacon is a longer cooldown, but it is a more powerful heal. Orb has Fortify, so it increases your teammates' armor, which makes them take less damage. So I generally prefer to go for Orb, but if you are a Beacon enjoyer, I think either variant of this build is fine. And with this, you would be wanting to go for the Divine Blessing ultimate upgrade. Again, it's more, if you have a passive that says you heal for more, you should pretty much always choose it, is my saying when it comes to life staff. So yeah, for PvE, we're going to be looking to lock something in like this for expeditions. Alternatively, this would also be acceptable as well. And then for those final points, you could go grab your Absolved, you could grab Protector's Touch, you could grab probably not Balance, actually, that's not that good. Life staff buffs lasting longer, something like this. Any of these passives that sound appealing to you would be good. But that's going to be our recommendation there for PvE. So we've got Sacred Ground, of course, Splash of Light, and Beacon for some ranges. And if we have everybody's all melee, then we're just going to go Sacred Ground, Orb, and Beacon. You guys get the idea. That's the run through for PvE. Now for PvP, player versus player, I prefer to run a single target heal. Not all single target heals, but I do like to run one particular single target heal, and that is Divine Embrace. I find that it's a lot more common in PvP that the enemy players will choose one player and they'll just focus on them and try and kill them as quickly as possible. So having that burst healing to react as opposed to AoE healing, because again, it's not very common in PvP that they're just doing blanket damage. It usually is more, at least if you want to be impactful, you're saving another healer or another DPS or somebody who's on the point. You're trying to save them from dying. So running a single target heal, I would recommend you go for. Also, I think Beacon, because it gives the movement speed increase, movement speed is a lot more important in PvP than it is in PvE because it allows your teammates to get in and out of the action. So this is typically what I would recommend taking for an upgrade. If we put these final points in here, we'll get Rebound, we'll get Blissful Touch, we'll get our final upgrade down here. And then we have quite a few choices here. We can remove debuffs, we can go for Intensify, we can go for Absolved, which I haven't really played too much with this because it is a newer passive. I think I would probably lock in something like this, and that would be my go-to for PvP. However, if you do prefer, if you find it easier to just go for Splash of Light, you could run the same build that you do from PvE. Light's Embrace, I typically don't find it to be as good. Divine Embrace, there is a perk called Refreshing Divine Embrace. We'll get to that a little bit later on. It gives you a better cooldown for the ability, which means you can use it a lot more often. So that's why I like to go for it there. But Light's Embrace does give stamina, which is pretty important in PvP. Being able to have stamina allows you to dodge. But again, I just like the cooldown and the big burst healing of Divine Embrace. So this is our PvP weapon mastery recommendation. Moving over to attributes. Again, there are a few discrepancies between PvP and PvE. Something that I would say is baseline for all healers, regardless of what content you're doing, is you do want to run at minimum 150 focus. If you're using a life staff and you're not using 150 focus, I feel like you're doing it wrong. The reason behind that is 150 gives us 20% extra outgoing healing, which is just a big deal. So that's the minimum amount of acceptable focus that I would recommend. But typically, in order to be a really effective healer, you do want to be going to that full 350 mark. I would say somewhere between 300 to 350 points. Obviously, this is going to require you to be max level. This is when we're level 65 and we have a lot of high gear score armor. So if you are, again, newer to New World and you're leveling up, aim for 150. That's the good spot to get to, and then you can sort of put your extra stats into Constitution or maybe Intelligence. If you're playing with the Void Gauntlet, you want it to do a bit more damage. The second most important stat for us as a healer, though, is Constitution. I would say priority number 1 is keeping our teammates alive, and then priority number 2 is keeping ourselves alive, because if we die, we can't do any healing. So again, I would recommend 100 Constitution is going to be the minimal acceptable amount of Constitution for most players. Unless you're very experienced, you might go below that, but 100 con is what I would recommend to go for. However, in PvP, I do think 150 Constitution is something that you want to aim for, because that makes you take less critical damage. This only applies in PvP, by the way. You can only get hit with crits in PvP. In PvE expeditions, there are no crits. This is something that we'll probably cover in a separate video, but just to make you guys aware. So this doesn't do anything in PvE other than just give you more health, but obviously having a bigger hit pool means you're less likely to die in one hit. So 100 con, 150 focus, those are your baseline stats. After that, as we move to level 65, when we get good gear, we want to be playing ideally between 300 and realistically 350 focus. 100 con for almost any content, 150 for PvP, potentially even going up to 200, and then any leftover stats, if you do want to, you can dabble with some Intelligence if you're playing with the Void Gauntlet. If you're playing with a Flail, I sometimes go up to 100 strength just to make my Flail do some damage. But again, as a healer, damage is not your primary, that's not your goal. You're there to keep people alive, and then you can do damage as like the third objective. So number 1, keep people alive. Number 2, keep yourself alive. Then number 3, maybe contribute some damage. So just bearing that in mind, most of our stats are going to go down here. Priority on focus, followed by Constitution, and then any leftover stats that you feel like you could put them towards Strength, Intelligence, maybe even Dexterity for some very weird builds. But that Rapier build that we talked about earlier, no Dexterity for that. Again, that Rapier is just there for its escape options. Another important aspect to the role of healer in New World Aeternum involves your equip load. This is calculated from the individual weight of each armor piece that you're wearing. So you can see right now I'm at 12.7, which is just under the medium equip load. If I go ahead and put a slightly heavier armor piece on, so right now we have a light helmet, but if I put a medium helmet on, you can see I move into the medium threshold. The medium says your dodge is a quick hop, dodge stamina cost is 50. We don't really care about that. What we do care about is when we go ahead and put that light helmet back on, we get the second line down, outgoing healing plus 30%. As we covered just earlier with the weapon mastery and the attributes, anything that says we do more healing, we typically want it. So 30% extra outgoing healing is a big deal, which means that you do need to be wearing some combination of armor pieces that is going to keep you in that light equip load. The go-to that I recommend is to wear a medium chest, and then everything else is going to be light. The reason behind this is if we go for a light chest, you can see we're still in a light equip load, but this light chest is providing us with less overall armor. So our armor rating just behind my camera down here, 723, 657 for physical and elemental. And if I go ahead and put that medium chest back on, we now have quite a bit more armor, 930 physical, 849 elemental, but we're still in light. So there's not like a difference between being in light and then super light. It's all light equip load, it's all medium, it's all heavy. So yeah, just be careful when wearing heavy armor pieces, because even like just 1 or 2, like if I put this heavy chest on, for example, this is going to really break things. This moves me into medium. And if I keep going and I wear some like heavy legs as well, and I put on a heavy helmet, you can see I've now moved into a heavy equip load, and that actually gives you minus 30% outgoing healing. So that's bad. When you do less healing, very, very bad. So stay away from heavy at all costs. Medium, you typically want to avoid as well. Aim for that light equip load, and the best way to do that by default is to go for a light helmet, a medium chest, and then everything else light. And then you can maximize the amount of armor that you get while still maintaining the 30% outgoing healing bonus. On the topic of gear, I want to briefly go over some important perks and gems that will also help you as a healer in New World Aeternum. Now, this is stuff that you don't really need to get too hooked up on as you are leveling up. So if you're in the lower levels, you know, you're 20, 30, 40, but once you get around like level 60, you start seeing some legendary pieces pop up. I want to help you guys make a few decisions in terms of what's going to be really good for you as a healer. So let's start off with the life staff. One very important perk on the life staff is Blessed. It says 12% outgoing healing. So again, as we've covered previously, if something says you do more outgoing healing, it's typically good to take it for the healer build, and Blessed is just a very straightforward example of that. There is also Savior and Desperate Prayer that increase outgoing healing. Those are a bit more conditional. They require you to be below a certain amount of mana for Desperate Prayer, or the enemy has to, not the enemy, the ally has to be under 50% HP, and then you heal them for more, whereas Blessed is just 12% extra all the time. Another thing that you can do with the life staff, and again, this is going to be more towards the late game, you can put a gem into your life staff. So if I hover over here, it'll ask me if I want to put the gem in. I already have a diamond in here. It's a rune glass diamond, which is, again, this is some very high level late game stuff, but typically just aim for a diamond. The cut pristine diamond, which is the tier 5, is the strongest tier, but any tier of diamond will increase your outgoing healing. This is the only gem that you can put in your weapon that modifies your healing, and if it gives you more healing, again, it's good. So diamond in the life staff, Blessed as a perk, and ideally you want to be looking for Refreshing Move as well for more cooldown reduction, and then any of the life staff weapon perks. So Fortifying Sacred Ground, Mending Protection, Keen Beacon, Refreshing Divine Embrace. Those are going to be your ideal perks, but as you're leveling up, you want to be looking for that Blessed life staff and the other important priorities. Put a diamond in it, and ideally look for a Refreshing Move as well. When it comes to armor, some important perks to look for, I would say just focus on getting Refreshing initially. The more armor pieces with Refreshing, the better, because this gives you cooldown reduction. So if you have 4 pieces of Refreshing, I actually have 5 on this gear, which is a bit weird. It's over the max. 4 is the most you can have. Any after that, they don't do anything negative, but they just don't do anything at all. So 4 pieces at 4%. Let's do some maths. That's 16% extra cooldown reduction. So our abilities are available 16% faster, which is good. Also, this Enchanted Ward perk here, which says you take less damage from light and heavy attacks. That fulfills criteria number 2 of a healer, which is not dying ourselves. So Refreshing allows us to fulfill the role number 1, which is to heal other people, and then Enchanted Ward is for role number 2, which is to make sure we don't die. And then the third perk, it's a little bit, you know, it's kind of up to you. Slash Conditioning gives us more damage reduction. There is also a new perk coming into the game, which I think is going to be more of a PvP thing. It's called Hastened Vigor, which will pop it up on the screen here, or Hasted Vigor. It'll give you some movement speed, that'll help you a lot more in PvP. But yeah, typically you want to be looking for Refreshing. Health and Enchanted Ward are also great perks. Freedom's going to help you in PvP to take less damage. Shirking Energy for more stamina. But again, just to keep things simple here, because we are going to do a full deep dive healer video, and we'll put a link to that up in the top right. The base perks are just look for Refreshing, look for Blessed on the life staff. Put the diamond in the life staff. And also, when it comes to the ring, there are some very important perks here. Sacred and Healing Breeze are going to increase your outgoing healing capacity by a good amount. Typically, Hearty is something you want to look for as well. This will give you an extra dodge roll. So without a Hearty ring, you're only going to be able to dodge twice, and then you run out of stamina. But with a Hearty ring, you can do 1, 2, 3 dodge rolls before you become exhausted. And that can help you a lot in both PvE and PvP in terms of staying alive and fulfilling criteria number 2. So we're now going to talk about the role of tanking in New World Aeternum. Now, unlike with Healer, there is some flexibility in terms of which weapons you can use as a tank. But when it comes to tanking in PvE activities, such as expeditions, mutated expeditions, elite trials, etc., there is a specific criteria that you always need to follow or meet, and that is having a carnelian gem socketed to your weapon. Now, if you're very early on your levels, this is going to sound a bit like gobbledygook, as the sort of early weapons that you get in New World Aeternum don't have gem slots. But as you level up and acquire blue, purple, and even like orange legendary items, you're going to find that most of them, if not all of them, have these empty sockets in them. And it says attach a gem to add its effect. And all you do is simply you drag a gem over. It has to be a cut gem, so it has to have the word cut in front of it. You can drag that over, to the item, and then it'll ask you if you want to socket it into the item. And you'll need to do this specifically with a type of gem called the carnelian. There's different tiers of these gems, and ideally you want to be using the highest tier that is available. You can purchase, the way that you acquire these gems, you get the uncut versions from mining iron, silver, gold, star metal, just mining nodes around the map, and then you cut the gems at the jewel crafting table. Alternatively, you can have a friend do this and then trade them to you, or you can buy them off of the trading post. But either way, one way or another, you're going to need to acquire yourself a carnelian gem and then put it into your weapon. The reason why this is important, it can be demonstrated by mousing over or hovering over the weapon here. It says taunts are active and you generate 150% more threat. Both of these lines are important for you tanking in PvE. The taunts are active in particular is very important, and I'm going to demonstrate that right now. So I'm going to have Gamgee pull aggro of this Lynx over here. So she's going to attack it, and the Lynx is going to come over to Gamgee and, you know, start attacking her, you know, because she has attention to the enemy. I'm not doing anything. If I go near this Lynx here, and then with my taunt gem in my hatchet, I press Berserk, you notice the Lynx now comes and attacks me. Even though I didn't do any damage to the Lynx is now focused on attacking me. And that is because I have a taunt gem, a carnelian gem in my weapon. And that ability that I used in particular is taunt gem compatible. Now, if you want to know which abilities are taunt gem compatible, you kind of just have to hover over them. So we can see Berserk says enter Berserk, increases, it has some description of the ability. And then the second bit of text at the bottom there says taunt gem compatible. If you have a carnelian gem equipped on your hatchet, activating this ability inflicts a taunt for 8 seconds to all enemies. So for the next 8 seconds, all enemies that are within 8 meters have to attack you. This only works in PvE. You can't taunt people in PvP, not currently. But there are several weapons. Most melee weapons do have this, and a few magical weapons as well. But if we go to Sword and Shield, which is what we're going to talk about mostly for the tanking perspective, we do have a taunt here. So Defender's Resolve is taunt gem compatible. We also have Shield Bash, which is taunt gem compatible. If we go over to a few other common tanking weapons like the Warhammer, we will have Sundering Shockwave, which is taunt gem compatible. You guys get the idea. There are various abilities in New World that once you have the carnelian gem socketed into your weapon, it allows you to force the enemy to attack you in a PvE setting. And this is very important because without this, you're going to struggle. You have to go around and make sure that you're constantly doing lots and lots of damage to the enemy to get them to focus on you, or doing lots of healing. That is another way to generate threat. On top of that, it also says you generate 150% more threat. What that basically means is the enemy, when you're attacking them, they just think you're more threatening. So if you're only hitting them for 100 damage, the enemy kind of thinks you're hitting them for like 200 damage or 300 damage, even though you're not. It's the way the game calculates it. So this is a very important aspect when it comes to PvE tanking. It's almost non-negotiable. You have to run a carnelian gem in your weapon unless you get to very late levels where there are special items or artifacts that you can get that replace these carnelian gems. But just wanted to cover that first, get it out of the way. When it comes to PvE tanking, you must have a carnelian gem socketed into your weapon, and your weapon needs to have ideally some sort of taunt as well. So yeah, like a Defender's Resolve or the Berserk on the hatchet, so on and so forth. So now that we've covered the importance of carnelian gems in PvE, let's talk about our weapon choice. As we mentioned, there are quite a few weapons. In fact, most of the weapons on this screen, with the exception of the musket, the bow, and the life staff, everything else has the ability to taunt in this game. That being said, there are some particular weapons that shine and are typical go-to choices for tanks in both PvE and PvP, but primarily we'll start with PvE, and that is the Sword and Shield and the Warhammer. These two weapons complement each other because they provide a lot of defensive options to keep you and your teammates alive. We have a little bit of movement. We have some ways to stagger and interrupt the enemy. We have stuns. We have knockbacks. We have rend, which reduces enemies' armor, allowing them to take more damage. There's just a nice complementary, like full roster of abilities that you would typically want to take as a tank. So let's take a look at our Sword and Shield weapon mastery and cover what we are recommending here. Again, you can be quite flexible with your weapon mastery and your weapon choice as a tank. If you want a full deep dive on tanking and weapon choice and weapon mastery, I am going to have a separate video just dedicated to tanks, but this video is supposed to be like a brief overview and introduction to the roles and responsibilities and some sort of general tips to what to look for in the tanking direction. So our Sword and Shield weapon mastery, primarily the reason why we see a Sword and Shield being used as a tanking weapon is because of the ability to use the shield. when you hold down block with left trigger or right mouse button, you take basically no damage. Instead, you just use your stamina as a resource, and your stamina as a resource when you're using a tower shield and you're in full heavy armor does go a long way. If we just block against these two guys here, you can see that we can hold down block for a decent amount of time without really getting in trouble, and the second we are going to run out of stamina, we can just let go of block, get some stamina back, and then go back into it again and hold down block. And you can stay alive for a very, very long time by doing this. If you imagine you have somebody with a life staff healing you as this goes on, you're basically never going to die. As long as you can use your block and manage your stamina correctly, by not having that happen, you're going to be in a good spot. Right, anyway, we got a bit distracted there. Let's actually cover the weapon mastery. So the 3 abilities I'm recommending we rock are Leaping Strike, Shield Rush, and Defender's Resolve. The reason behind this is because it gives us access to some movement, so we can get in and out of the action faster. If there's an archer in the backline that we need to get to quicker, Leaping Strike is going to allow us to do that quickly. We can just dive over to an enemy. We just aim at them, then press the button, and we get there. Shield Rush is there because there is a perk that you can get, and we're going to cover perks a little bit later on, but there's a perk you can get that you put on your shield called Fortifying Shield Rush. I don't actually know if we have it here. We don't, but there is a perk over here called Fortifying Shield Rush, and it says when you hit an enemy with the Shield Rush ability, you get a huge amount of Fortify. Fortify increases your armor, which just makes you very, very tanky. So it's just a very good ability to use on cooldown to give you that large increase in armor. On top of that, we just have the benefit of weakening the enemy, which reduces their damage, which is going to be beneficial to us and anybody else that the enemy is attacking. And we can slow them as well, which isn't as important in PvE, but slows are very powerful in PvP. Finally, we do have our Taunt ability over here. This is Defender's Resolve. It reduces incoming damage by 30%. We take less stamina damage, which again is going to help with just holding down block and not dying. And then we get some increased damage reduction when we're holding a tower shield, which is going to be our go-to shield as a tank. The round shield and the kite shield, they don't offer as much block stability, which means your stamina bar is going to go down a lot faster when you're blocking with the round shield or kite shield, so you pretty much always going to be rocking that tower shield. I've opted to go for the defensive formation. You have ultimates in these weapon mastery trees. Depending on how many points you put into either the right side or the left side, you'll be able to pick up an ultimate at the bottom. These require you putting 10 points into one side, and then your 11th point is spent down here. So you can only get one or the other, and if you want to respec, you can choose them. But defensive formation just gives us even more damage reduction, so it really leans into that sort of tanky role. But if you are feeling a bit more aggressive, it's pretty common that we see some more advanced tanks go for leadership. This increases the damage of you and all your party members as long as you are holding the sword and shield in your hand. Other important passives that I like to pick up include Sturdy Shield, gives you more physical armor. We also have Elemental Resistance, reduces damage you take from magical damage. We have Final Blow, even to generate more threat. Recuperation to increase our incoming healing. Defensive Training to give us more Fortify when we block, so we get more armor. And Sturdy Grip, which reduces that melee damage when somebody hits our shield, so our stamina bar lasts longer. I do like to pick up quite a few of the Sword Master passives as well. So Empowered Stab I think is very good whenever you do a heavy attack, so you hold down right trigger or left mouse button. You get a 30% kind of damage increase for 5 seconds. So if we just do this and we hit the enemy, we get that Empowered Stab, and then just everything else that we follow up with that. So as long as you can be doing a heavy attack once every 5 seconds, boom, lots of extra damage. Some Rend to reduce the enemy's armor. Precision to increase our crit chance, more damage, and finally more damage. Because although staying alive is important as a tank, you know, that's kind of like your primary role, get the enemy's attention and stay alive, we still want to be doing good amounts of damage, because damage equals threat. So the more damage you do, the more threat you generate, and the more likely the enemy will focus on you. If you just go all in on the defense and you don't do any damage, if you just sit there blocking, the enemy won't actually attack you outside of your taunt window. So when your taunt isn't up, if you're not doing any damage, the enemy's not going to attack you. So make sure you are attacking them. We're going to cover this in the tips and tricks, but you can't just be sitting there holding block the whole time as a tank. It is important that you do actually attack the enemy from time to time as well, especially in PvE. Now, if we were going to tank in PvP, things get a little bit more complicated, because taunts don't work on enemies in PvP. You can't taunt the enemy over. So instead, what we're going to be looking to do is kind of just disrupt the enemy, get in their faces, and still stay alive. So to that extent, I actually recommend that we take Shield Bash, Shield Rush, and Leaping Strike. The reason behind this is because we have a pretty hefty slow down here, so we can slow the enemy. Shield Bash is a stun. We can actually upgrade this to make the stun last even longer. So if we go over here and grab these, Concussive Bash increases Shield Bash's stun duration by 1 second. So we've got a 3-second stun over here. We have a Stagger, which is basically like an interrupt with a slow, 30% slow. And then we have another 30% slow over here, which also staggers the enemy when you hit them. So we have 2 staggers, 2 slows, and a stun. Very, very annoying, you know. If we just choose somebody and we want to make them miserable, we can just go in with this. So if you find a healer in the back line, you can Leaping Strike into them, then hit them with the Shield Rush, then hit them with the Shield Bash, and they basically just don't get to play the game for like the next 6-7 seconds. Alternatively, if you're fighting for the point, if you find the enemy lowers their block, you can keep them stunned for a long time as well, keep them out of the action. After here, you have the choice to go again for defensive formation or leadership, and it's kind of up to you as to what you want to go for. I would again be inclined to go for defensive formation just to really lean into that fantasy of being a tank, but if you wanted to, you could pick up quite a lot of other passives over here. But we'll just go for the passives that we like again to increase our damage. So we got one last point over here, and I think we're actually going to take the movement speed increase because movement speed is pretty important in PvP. So this is what my PvP sword and shield setup would look like, but again, there is so much flexibility here. You could go for whatever you want. Jumping over to the Warhammer real quick, I think you could use both of these setups in both PvE and PvP. When you're doing expeditions, I think something like this would look pretty good. We've got our Taunt with Shockwave, which also, you know, can weaken the enemy to reduce the damage they do. Clear Out, it says it knocks back, but it actually just knocks down the enemies. When you're in expeditions, simply just knocks them down instead. Which is kind of handier because, you know, if you spread them all out, it makes it harder for your damage players. You want them all nice and neatly packed up on top of you so they can hit them all at the same time. And then we've got Armor Breaker, which applies a very powerful rend, reducing the target's armor, making them take a lot more damage. We've also picked up Aftershock. It's not really that important in PvE, but you can slow some enemies. This is going to come in great in PvP. And then we've just picked up some other passives that I think, you know, would help either help us take less damage or help us do more damage, give us a little bit of healing. But again, there is quite a lot of flexibility with what you want to go to here. The big change that I would make for this, if you were going to play in like a PvP tank, a disruptor as it's often called, is I would switch out Clear Out for Path of Destiny, just to give you a little bit more ranged options. You can use Path of Destiny, hit the ground with it, and it will stagger people in front of you. So you can use this on archers and healers and people in the backline who are trying to escape from you. So we just simply switch out, Clear Out, take these 4 points, put 3 of them into here, and then your 4th and final point, just picking up any other passive that seems good to you, honestly. Maybe Contemption, I would think we would consider going for. In terms of attributes for the role of tank, it probably comes as no surprise, but you do want to be heavily investing in Constitution. Since our primary role and responsibility involves sitting on the front line and absorbing lots of damage, Constitution is going to increase our HP pool, our health, and it's important to have a nice big health pool because otherwise you're just going to die very quickly, right? And then you won't be a very effective tank. Now, that being said, you don't want to dump all of your points into Constitution. As we covered with the PvE importance, doing some damage is going to allow you to maintain threat, maintain the attention of the enemy. Now, technically from a PvP standpoint, if you were playing Arena, Outpost Rush, or War, you might just want to go all the way to 350 Constitution, just because killing the enemy is going to be something that your damage players do. But in PvE, you do want to make sure that you're doing some damage, because that's going to allow you to generate threat and keep the enemy's attention on you. So I think like 200 is a nice sort of milestone basis to go off of, you know, something just a good foundation to build from, and then putting more points into Constitution or more points into Strength depending on what you feel like. The reason why we're going with specifically Strength is because Warhammer only scales with Strength. However, if you were wanting to focus on the Sword and Shield, because it does scale 65% with Dexterity, there's an unusual thing, or maybe not unusual, but not as well known to new players, where once you get to a certain point in Strength, it actually becomes better to put points into Dexterity. This is a quite complicated topic, so we're going to save it for another video. But technically, once we get to like 200 points in Strength, we'll actually get more damage with the Sword and Shield for our first sort of 50 points into Dexterity. So something like this would probably be optimal for Sword and Shield damage when we have a, you know, we don't have a full points yet. I don't actually have jewelry on this character. I'm not using any attribute, food, or whatever, but 200, so 200 strength, 200 constitution is what I'm going to recommend you go for. And then the additional points, you could put more in strength to give you a warhammer and sword and shield damage. You could put some points into dexterity, which will give you the damage while you're at full health, crit chance, and it will get your sword and shield to do more damage. Or you could just put all the points into constitution. just to make sure that you can stay alive longer. But this is something like this is what I'm going to recommend that you guys go for. It's going to be my rough guideline. And again, we're going to have a more of a deep dive on tanking and all the different variables in a separate video. But just for a basic introduction, this is what I'm kind of suggesting to you guys. For your equip load, which is this text up here just above your armor slots, probably comes as no surprise, but you want to be wearing a lot of heavy armor as a tank because it's going to increase the amount of armor that you have. You want to be using a tower shield, which does weigh a lot. If I take my tower shield off here, you can see it drops down the equip load by a significant margin. So tower shields do weigh a ton, but they are important for giving you that block stability so your stamina goes further. So yeah, it probably comes as no surprise, but we're just going to be wearing full heavy. Every single piece of armor should be heavy. I've actually got some light gloves here, weirdly enough, but everything should be heavy for a sort of typical tanking build. Sometimes you go with medium, and very rarely you go with light for some weird speedrun tank builds, but I would say for the majority of people who are new to New World Aeternum, every single piece of armor being heavy, and also the tower shield instead of the round shield or the light shield, that's going to be my recommendation for a classic tanking build in New World Aeternum. Finally, let's jump in with a few quick tips and tricks for the tank. There's only really 2 pieces of information that I want to do in this quick guide. The first one we've already kind of covered, but it's don't just hold down block. I see a lot of rookie or new tanks that go up to the enemy and they think that tanking looks like this. You basically get close to the enemy, you press the taunt, and then you just hold down block, and that's you covered, you know, that's all they do. They might occasionally go for a shield rush or something like that, or maybe switch to the Warhammer to then do another taunt. But they spend most of the time either taunting or blocking, and that's it. The problem with this is your other players in your party are going to be doing damage. Your healer is going to be healing. All of those actions generate threat. Right now, I'm basically generating no threat at all. Outside of the taunts, I'm effectively, you know, I don't exist to the enemy. So although this guy is only attacking me right now, I guarantee that if I had a party member nearby who was attacking the corruption entity, that party member would immediately take the attention of the enemy because, again, I'm not posing as a threat right now. If I want to be threatening, I got to start doing some of this. So don't be afraid, and in fact, I encourage you to make sure that you're attacking frequently. If your health is almost full, honestly, if your health is above 50%, just attack. Only when it gets below sort of 50 do you really want to go into that defensive mode. And even then, I think quite often it's good to trust your healer. As long as you're standing in that sacred ground, so you're going to get 50% extra incoming healing, and it's just such a good deal. So yeah, don't be afraid to attack. Attack often. The second tip that I want to give relates to ranged enemies. Another mistake that you'll often see rookie tanks making is they'll focus on the enemies that are right in front of them here. Meanwhile, they'll have an archer or a mage or some sort of enemy in the distance that only does ranged attacks, and they won't be generating any aggro. They won't be generating threat on that enemy in the distance. They'll do a taunt, but that enemy will be outside of taunt range. And what that means is as your healer is healing you, your healer is going to be generating threat, and then the ranged enemy is going to start attacking your healer. However, there's a simple solution to solving this problem. All of these melee enemies are very focused on you, so you hit them a couple of times just to generate threat. And then you bring the melee enemies over to the ranged enemy, and you fight on top of the ranged enemy. It's a very simple trick, and I know it sounds like I'm, you know, maybe being a bit patronizing here, but you'd be surprised how many tanks don't respect this rule and how much more painful it makes healing in New World Aeternum. So yeah, fight on top of ranged enemies. Just be aware of your surroundings. Take a look around. Once you see those red squiggly bars around the enemy, that indicates that you have aggro, so that's an important factor. So if you see an archer in the distance and it doesn't have the red squiggles, so if I just go find one more enemy real quick, like this guy over here, we can see his HP bar, no red squiggles around it, which means he's currently not interested in me. But once we have the red squiggle highlighting around the HP bar, that's how you tell the enemy is focused on you, and that's what you want to see with every single enemy that your team is engaged in combat. So yeah, fight on top of the ranged enemies. Make sure you see those red squiggles all the time. If you're not, hit them with the taunt, go over and hit them. Don't sit there with block, and don't ignore the ranged enemies. Those are my top tips for you going into tanking in New World Aeternum, and that is going to carry you so much further. than the vast majority of other new tanks who haven't watched this video. Now, jumping into your gear and what's important to look for as a tank, the first thing we've already covered, but you want to make sure that you have a gem slot in your weapon, so you have that little circle to put something in, and you want to have a carnelian gem. Without this, the taunts are not going to be active, and you're not going to be generating anywhere near as much threat, which is going to make it a lot harder to tank in PvE. In PvP, you don't need to look for this. This is not required at all, so just go for like a diamond or an opal or even a jasper. That is a good option as well. Jasper says that when somebody hits you, I wonder if I have an example of a jasper in here. Yeah, gain a stack of 8% damage after blocking or taking a hit. This can be very good as an alternative in PvP because you're going to get hit a lot and then you're going to be able to do more damage as a result. For my sword, I really like to have the refreshing move perk. The reason behind this is our taunt ability on the sword, Defender's Resolve, has a very long cooldown. You can see that 25 seconds there, but every time we hit him with the enemy, we're going to be lowering the cooldown. You can see it's flashing and it's going down every time. And this, over the span of many fights, can mean that the cooldown can come out like 10 seconds faster or something like that. And the reason why that's happening is because of the refreshing move perk. Light and heavy attacks reduce active weapon cooldowns by 2.5%. So basically every attack, it's a 0.2 second cooldown. So if you're hitting a huge pack of enemies, only like every other enemy is going to count, but it is a big deal. Other perks on the sword I think are very negotiable. I like to go for Trenchant Rend, but again, I think this is much more of an end game thing. As you're leveling up, just focus on getting the taunt gem and then ideally getting refreshing move. But other perks to look for. I think Trenchant Rend is very nice, but it's pretty much crafted only. And it means when you hit the enemy, you're going to put the rend on them. And you want to be doing heavy attacks very often because you get that empower bonus that we talked about, which increases your damage, but it's going to be a double whammy because it's also going to put rend on the enemy, reducing their armor. So heavy attacks have like now a double purpose where it triggers your, what is it called? Empowered stab. And it also triggers the Trenchant Rend perk as well. For the Warhammer, I don't think there are any absolute must-have perks. I usually just aim to get some sort of weapon perk on my Warhammer. So Sundering Clearer, it says Clearer inflicts rend, reducing target's armor. There's another perk called Sundering Shockwave, but typically looking for one of those weapon perks, the perk that modifies the ability to do something a little bit more. I think that's the most important thing, because Warhammer is usually just there to, you switch to it, you use an ability, and then you switch back. You don't often spend a lot of time just bonking the enemy with the Warhammer. You usually want to be attacking with the sword and shield to take advantage of that refreshing move. On your armor, again, I don't believe there are any absolute must-have perks. Enchanted Ward is probably the most valuable, reduces damage from light and heavy attacks, so anybody who's hitting you with just a left click, and this works in both PvE and PvP, but basically anybody who's attacking you, you're just going to reduce incoming damage, which is very nice. So getting Enchanted Ward on as many pieces as possible, this is something you want to be looking for on your gear. Again, don't get too hooked up on it as you're leveling up. It's not a deal breaker. Just go for your high gear score pieces as you're leveling. But later on, Enchanted Ward's going to be very powerful. Elemental Aversion is the alternative, which is less damage from ranged elemental attacks. So it's a bit more specific, but it can help. And Refreshing, just like with the Healer, is going to be a good option as well. Refreshing reduces cooldowns, so you can use your taunt, you can use your stuns, you can use your abilities more often, which is going to help you as a tank. So Refreshing and Enchanted Ward would be, say, that's what you should focus on. Health is a decent option on tank because you do have a big health pool, so increasing it even more going to allow you to stay alive. And the conditioning perks, which say you take less damage from a particular source when you receive the damage, I think that helps a lot as a tank as well. On your shield, there is a very important perk. We covered it earlier, but it's called Fortifying Shield Rush. It says, after hitting an enemy with Shield Rush, gain Fortify, increasing your armor by 35%. It's a big deal. If we hit the enemy with the Shield Rush here, we suddenly get a huge increase in armor, and we just become so much more tanky. So I think making sure that you get the Fortifying Shield Rush on the shield is super important. It's so important that I would go for a much lower gear score shield just to make sure you have that perk. This is like by far the most important thing to have in the shield. The other ones are kind of like optional. I've got Hated here, which again, you got to remember this doesn't work in PvP. You can also get this perk on shields called Shield Ward, and you receive less damage from a particular damage type. So we've got less nature damage here. Over here, we have less fire damage, which is going to be nice in PvP because there's lots of fire staffs. So this may be another perk that you want to consider picking up, but basically prioritize that Fortifying Shield Rush. That's what it's all about. Amulet-wise, again, health, really good. Protection is going to help you, and stamina recovery. This is also a very nice perk for a tank because you're going to be taking damage often, so it's fairly frequently you'll get hit below 50% health, but then suddenly your stamina comes all the way back up to, you get 100 stamina back when you drop below 50% health, which means you can just start blocking immediately. So Basically just replenishes your stamina, and that's very nice for the tank in particular because we can do a lot with our stamina. Speaking of which, I think Hearty to increase your max stamina just so you can block more. Leeching for more damage, Keen for more damage, or Leeching to give you some lifesteal. And on the Earring, there's another very important perk for tanking in PvE. It's called Despise. Again, I don't recommend too much taking the hated perk on the sword or the shield. I don't think they're super needed because there are some other good perks there. But on the Earring, there's not that many good Earring perks, if I'm being honest, so putting Despised on your Earring for PvE tanking would definitely recommend. Regenerating is also going to help you out as a tank because just constantly having health coming back while you're blocking, again, good for survivability. Finally, let's jump into the role of damage in New World Aeternum. Now, just like with healer and tank, there are some discrepancies and changes in playstyle depending on whether you're doing PvE, player versus environment, or PvP, player versus player. In PvE, it is very common that you will see a lot of damage players playing with melee weapons. So these are your one-handed and two-handed melee weapons. We have the spear, the great axe, the warhammer, greatsword, hatchet, flail, rapier, sword, and shield. The reason behind this is from a PvE standpoint, you typically have a melee tank. So your tank players, as we covered in the tank section, usually playing with sword and shield, warhammer, weapons on this left side here because they have the better taunts and they're more well set up for tanking in general as opposed to trying to tank with a fire staff. It's a bit more tricky to make that happen. From the healer's perspective, the healer, as we covered, is typically playing with Sacred Ground and then usually going with some other AoE healing abilities as well. So you, as a damage player, can kind of benefit your healer and your tank the most by staying close to them. If you stay close to your tank, it's going to make it easier for the tank to keep track of all the enemies, because if you're playing with a bow or a fire staff and you're in the back and you take the attention of the enemy, that enemy is going to run all the way over to the tank, and then the tank has to chase over after them, use a taunt and stuff. So melee weapons usually create like a better synergy in playstyle in terms of everybody standing inside of Sacred Ground, in terms of your tank doesn't have to go too far to attack the enemy. It has, as we've seen in the past few years of New World being available on the PC, been the preferential go-to choice. That being said, if you do enjoy playing with the bow or the fire staff, ice gauntlet, any weapons, and you want to use those in PvE, if you want to run those in expeditions, it's not a crime, it's not going to get you in trouble or whatever, but I'm just going to be giving some pointers and some recommendations, especially when it comes to mutated expeditions, is what has been working for us so far. Before the game came to Xbox and PlayStation, it was typically a lot of melee weapons. However, in PvP, things are quite different. Usually we'll see a lot more ranged weapons in PvP, especially in Outpost Rush. When people are playing on their own, they'll usually choose to play with a bow or a musket or a fire staff and sit in the back lines because it's often considered a lot safer. I think one of the big differences in the way that I can kind of demonstrate this, why you would see some weapons being used more in PvE and some more in PvP, is just by virtue of the fact that if you're in PvE, I go up to this crocodile here, he will just come to me. He's just going to chase me all the time. Obviously, some archer enemies are a little bit different, but generally, the AI here is just programmed to run towards me. Whereas when you're fighting against another player, sometimes they'll try and run away, they'll dodge, they'll use movement, they'll try and create distance. You know, obviously players generally tend to play quite a lot smarter than the AI. So from a PvE standpoint, knowing that the enemy is just going to come to you most of the time, melee weapons make a lot of sense, but in PvP, where the enemy might be inclined to run away, especially if they're a healer, having those ranged options usually are more beneficial. So my go-to weapon recommendation that we're going to start with, and we're going to explain a bit more as to why this works, is going to be Greatsword and Spear, and this will be from a PvE standpoint. But perhaps in PvP, you might want to substitute either the Greatsword or the Spear with a bow. So we could be looking like Greatsword and bow, or spear and bow. Those are the sort of general recommendations that we're going to be going towards in terms of weapon choice. But again, damage is very, very extensive here. You can pretty much use any of these weapons as a damage weapon with the exception of the life staff. Everything here can be and has been used in various damage setups in both PvE and PvP. But in order to not have this video go for another 2 hours, we are going to be locking into spear and greatsword for PvE. And then let's say we'll go for spear and bow in PvP. Now, before we jump into the weapon mastery, I want to briefly go over why exactly we're choosing spear and greatsword, these two weapons paired together, or spear and bow, for this damage build. Again, I did say you can run many combinations of these weapons, but as with the life staff for healing and the sword and shield for tanking, there are particular reasons why the spear, especially paired with the greatsword, is a good combo. The reason behind this, and this is a logic you can apply to your other damage builds, is one of the weapons functions as a main hand weapon. And what I mean by this is the weapon that you're going to spend the majority of the time. You're going to have it out, and you're going to be doing the default attacks, so the light and heavy attacks. And that is the Greatsword. The Greatsword in particular has some of the best heavy attacks in the game. This weapon loves to do heavy attacks, especially because of its ultimate in the Weapon Mastery skill tree. Every time you land a heavy attack, it lowers your cooldown, so you can use them more often. You can even go over to the right side skill tree, and light or heavy attacks can give you lifesteal. So the Greatsword loves to be a main hand weapon. It loves to be the weapon that you attack with most of the time. And the Spear, whilst it can be an excellent main hand weapon, is also a fantastic utility weapon. And what I mean by that is the abilities on the Spear are really, really good in both PvE and PvP. The abilities that we've chosen here, which we're going to jump into, Skewer applies a very strong and powerful bleed. You can upgrade Skewer to Enfeebling Skewer to make it apply a weaken as well, which reduces the enemy's damage. Very strong debuff. With Perforate, you can rend the enemy to make them take more damage. And again, you can get a perk on the Spear or your armor called Fortifying Perforate to increase your armor. And then with Cyclone, you have the ability to lifesteal to give you back a lot of health and a lot of stamina. So you get like nearly a full heal with a stamina restore. You've got a powerful debuff in Perforate. You've got a powerful debuff in Weaken. It's just a great weapon to switch to, use the abilities, and then switch back. And this is sort of a logic that I want to help you guys, the thought process that you should be thinking about for your damage builds. It's like, all right, what's bringing the damage, and then what am I using for the debuffs, you know, to slow the enemy, to put a bleed on them, to reduce them, because you can't be attacking with both weapons at the same time, right? You can only have one weapon in your hand at a time. So you have to make the decision as to what's going to be your main weapon, and then what's going to be the weapon that you'll switch to for its abilities, for its utility. So in this case, we have our main weapon, Greatsword, and then we have our utility weapon, Spear. This could also, you could replace the Spear with a Great Axe, because this, again, the Great Axe has some fantastic utility abilities with Gravity Well, and then you've also got your Reap to pull enemies in, and then you have your Maelstrom to pull enemies in as well. So if you just want to pull lots of enemies into you, you can use Great Axe for that, and then switch to the Greatsword and cleave them all down. Again, we will do a separate deep dive video for all of these different damage combinations and the popular builds, but I just wanted to explain why in particular we're choosing these weapons. So that being said, let's go into the weapon mastery, starting with the Spear. We've just chosen the abilities with the Spear. That's the thing that we want to use the Spear the most for. So Skewer, again, very powerful bleed, also has the ability, if you fully upgrade it, to give you an Empower, which increases your damage, although this will only be active while you have the Spear in your hand. So as soon as you weapon swap away, that particular buff from follow through will disappear. We went for Perforate. As we mentioned, it does apply a rend to the enemy, which makes them take more damage. It also conveniently applies a weaken as well, so you can make the enemy take more damage and inversely do less damage to you, your tank, and your party. And then I opted to go for Cyclone for my final ability because it restores stamina. We don't need to take this final upgrade. It's not too important in PvE, but I think these three abilities here are just excellent for the debuffs and the bleeds that they provide. And then other passives that I would recommend. I think most of the passives on the right side are honestly pretty solid. Just doing more damage, doing, again, more damage. Generally, passives that say you do more damage, or if they lower your cooldowns so you can use your damaging or debuffing abilities more often, that's also go-to as well. So just like with healing, if something says you do more healing, if something says you do more damage, it's generally a good one to go for, or increasing your crit chance, because that can also be considered a damage increase as well. In terms of the ultimates for the Spear, I very much think the right side ultimate is a lot better than the left side ultimate right now. For the left side ultimate, your stamina has to be full. Maybe some of you guys who don't like dodging or blocking very much, if you just want to sort of stand there and do attacks, if you want the Spear to be your main weapon, you could consider reserve strength instead. But I think in doing more damage based on the number of debuffs in the enemy, when we already have 1, 2 debuffs right here, in fact 3 debuffs, because we've got the weaken, we have the rend, and we have a bleed over here, so we can already get 30% extra damage. So I just think for me this is the ideal skill tree. You could look to switch out Cyclone with leg sweep if you want to bring in more CC, crowd control, to lock down the enemies and stop them from moving. Moving over to the greatsword, our main weapon. Again, the thing that we're using the greatsword for the most part is just for its light and heavy attacks, but there are some great abilities on the greatsword as well. I would recommend picking up Relentless Rush. This is a nice movement ability which can help you close the gap on enemies. It also does some pretty good damage, and with the buffs that we've picked up, if you upgrade the Relentless Rush ability, you can also get an Empower, which will increase the amount of damage you do, and you can get a 50% cooldown reduction, so you can use it a lot more often. Next ability I opted for was Skyward Slash. Again, just a nice extra damage ability. It also applies Rend. Rend is an important debuff in both PvE and PvP, but especially in PvE. Making the enemy take more damage just means you'll get through those bosses faster. The left side ultimate, I think, is a little bit better than the right side ultimate, but if you want a bit more healing, a bit more self-sustain, playing a more solo Undying Defiance might be the preference to go for, but Unrelenting Onslaught just says every time we hit somebody with a light attack, or especially with a heavy attack, which is what you primarily want to be doing with the greatsword, by the way. It is a very heavy attack centric weapon. You can be lowering your cooldowns very drastically with that left side ultimate, so that's our recommendation to go for there. It's also easier to get to because we've already invested quite a few points in this left side skill tree with Skyward Slash and Relentless Rush. Your third ability, it's kind of optional here. In PvE, I'm going to opt to go for Roaring Rupture. When you're in an expedition, this can just be handy to group up enemies. So when you're in Onslaught stance, which is red mode, you're going to be in that most of the time. It's going to, when you use this ability, it's going to pull the enemies in, just making it easier to hit them all with those heavy attacks again. Also applies Weaken. Again, we love Weaken. We love Rend in PvE. It's also pretty good in PvP. I think there are some must-have passives that you got to get over here. Unflinching Blade on the right side, I would recommend always going for that. It gives you grit when you do heavy attacks. Grit basically means you can't be interrupted, so when you do a heavy attack, you'll glow white briefly, and people can't stop you at that point. You become kind of unstoppable. So Unflinching Blade is very, very good for the playstyle of the greatsword, a passive that I always recommend you go for, friends. And then over on the left side, there's a lot of good passives over here. Aggressive Shift. Every time you land a charged heavy attack, you'll move into the red stance, which again, we can show on the skill tree here. But there's the red stance and the blue stance with the greatsword. So this is red over here and the buffs it gives you. And then this is blue over here and the buffs it gives you. When you use a blue ability, you move into the blue mode. When you use a red ability, you move into the red mode. But you can also just enter into red mode every time you do a heavy attack. So it's very handy to make sure you're always in red, because you always get that damage increase. Critical hit chance, again, we covered. Anything that increases your crit or your damage is good. We've got some great passives here with stamina and health regen. Again, 100% guaranteed crit when you enter into red mode. Something that says Empower, which is increasing your damage. Very good. So this is our default sort of layout for the greatsword there, and this is going to be our standard go-to PvE for the spear. And then from the PvP standpoint, not too much changes really with the spear. I think Skewer is still a really good ability for the bleed that it puts on enemies. Just make sure they're taking damage over time. Also makes it easier to get the Exploited Weakness ultimate, which is still the better of the two, especially in PvP, because you almost certainly will be using your stamina a lot more often in PvP to dodge out of the way of enemies. So going with the Exploited Weakness just ends up being a lot better. Sweep, I feel like, becomes a lot more important in PvP, because again, for those pesky healers who are going to run away, or other archers and people using fire staffs, they'll run away. So if you can knock them down with the sweep, it's going to give you a big damage bonus. And again, I really like Cyclone because it gives you stamina back, which is very important for staying alive. And the Leeching Cyclone perk you can put on your armor or weapon gives you a lot of health. The bow instead of the greatsword, that's our secondary weapon that we're recommending to run for this build here, because it gives us those ranged options. And as we talk about in PvP, it's a lot more common that people will create distance from you as opposed to just guaranteeing they'll stand right next to you. So the spear's going to be a really good PvP option because of the gap closer you have with Skewer. It actually pulls you forward a little bit like this. And then when the enemy does try and run away, we can just use that bow as our secondary. And the abilities that we've opted to go for on the bow are mainly single target damage. So if you wanted to do a bit more AoE, area of effect, on the point, you could go for something like a rain of arrows instead. But Evade Shot is our friend because it gives us a haste increase. Movement speed is very important in PvP. It also has a stagger to interrupt players. And then I've just opted to go for Poison Shot and Explosive Shot here. There is like a little bit of attack you can do with bow and arrow where you basically line up a heavy attack, and as you release it, you go straight into your poison arrow or explosive arrow. So if we release this heavy attack and then straight into the explosive arrow afterwards, you can see like that, and you can do it again. Heavy attack straight into the poison shot. You can kind of like rapid fire these two abilities in there to just get a big chunk of damage off straight away. So I do think taking the single target damage abilities, you could even go pen shot if you wanted to really emphasize that heavy attack into an ability kind of combo. And then passives over here. Again, things that say you do more damage. Those are your go-tos. I do like this ultimate on the left side a lot more than the right side ultimate. It says after you dodge, you deal 15% more damage. It's a very easy criteria to meet. Just dodge and then attack. And then when you're going to see that sort of little fist icon, that empower pop off or disappear, you can just dodge and reset it again. So you're going to be doing a lot of dodging in PvP, and I just think it's a lot easier to do this than to land headshots. So these are our go-to options. We've got evade shot for a little bit of escape, give us a haste buff, stagger the enemy, and then we've just got some nice damage with the heavy attack into explosive arrow, heavy attack into poison arrow. And that covers our PvP weapon mastery for bow, spear, and PvE for greatsword and spear. For attributes and our damage builds, we are looking at dexterity, strength, and constitution. Dexterity is going to be the one that we'll focus on the most because spear, which is used in both builds, primarily scales with dexterity, and then strength is its secondary. The greatsword is a unique weapon where it scales equally off of both strength and dexterity, so points in either one, again, it'll be the equal amount of damage. And then the bow will only scale off of dexterity, so points that we put into strength do not benefit the bow. However, you're not going to be able to do this in your earlier levels, but as you move closer to the level cap of 65 and you have quite a few points to play around with like I do, I recommend going to 100 strength even with the bow build, because this gives you 10% extra physical damage. And this is a very important milestone to hit for, I think, most of your damage builds, unless you're using like a fire staff or an ice gauntlet, you know, basically a magical weapon. But any physical weapons, getting 10% extra physical damage, again, although the bow doesn't scale at all off of strength, these threshold bonuses will still give it extra damage. So your 10% extra heavy attack damage does benefit the bow. Anything else, like 49 points into strength doesn't benefit, 99 points into strength doesn't benefit the bow, but once we hit that 100, we get that extra physical damage. So it's the threshold points that really give you some big damage increases here. Extra light attack damage, then extra heavy attack damage, that's really good for the greatsword, and then extra physical damage, good for the greatsword and the bow and the spear. Primarily, though, we're going to be looking towards dexterity, and we're just going to be trying to push as high as we can. So I think stopping at 100 strength is going to be good for all of the builds that we recommend here, just to briefly cover things. With constitution, just like with healing, I think 100 constitution is a nice place to be. As you get more confident, you maybe want to drop your constitution lower, but I would say for most people, even including myself, I'm typically playing with 100 constitution, and in player versus player, or PvP, I think 150 for that less critical damage. Again, as we covered, the critical damage is only for PvP. You can't take critical damage when you're fighting the AI. This only happens when you're fighting other players, but 150 constitution for PvP is very nice. So milestones that we're looking for here, friends: 100 strength for all builds at all times. Very good for that extra physical damage. But we are going to be focusing on dexterity first. So from the very beginning, as you level up, if you want to go for the damage roll and use these builds, focus on dexterity, try and get that nice and high. I think getting to around that 200 threshold is going to be, you know, that's where the damage really starts coming in. After that point, we're going to start going for the 100 strength. And of course, we got to, you know, throw a few points over to constitution, aiming to get around that 100 constitution, 150 for PvP. And then the remainder of my stats in this case are just going towards dexterity. Obviously, we have attribute food that we can eat, but we'll be covering that in a separate video, probably in the deep dive for damage builds. And if you want to check that out, there'll be a link to it up in the top right. That's what our stats are looking like for PvP. And then for PvE, we're just taking those extra points and slapping them into dexterity. Once we get to 350, we'll just take a little bit more strength. So there we go. And these are our PvE stats. Finally, let's jump into gear, equipment, perks for your character. Again, as you level up, there isn't really anything that's super important from the damage perspective. Some perks that you want to be keeping your eye out for, we've already covered those in the weapon mastery, but Leeching Cyclone is a Really fantastic perk to give you that lifesteal. So if you can find Leeching Cyclone and a piece of armor, it really makes that Cyclone ability excellent. On the spear, I've opted to go for Enfeebling Skewer. We covered that in the weapon mastery section, but this is such a powerhouse perk. When you put it on your spear, reduces target's damage by 47%. You're cutting their damage in half with this perk on your spear. Now, obviously, this is with a high gear score spear, but I do think from a PvE and even a PvP perspective, this is a very powerful debuff to put on the enemy, and it makes Skewer like one of the best abilities in the game. Another important perk I would say you would aim for is Relentless Freedom. It says activating Relentless Rush removes roots and slows. So when you do that spin attack with the greatsword, you remove all the slows and roots on you. This is great in PvP, but even in PvE in expeditions, this can still be very handy. So the main important perks that you could be looking for as a damage player, honestly, are those weapon perks. Leeching Cyclone, Relentless Rush, Enfeebling Skewer in particular. I think those ones are good. And then we also have the Fortifying Perforate for the spear, and we have Bleeding Sweep as well. Those are also excellent. Defensive perks, I think Enchanted Ward is going to be great when we're playing in melee and also in range. Just taking less damage from light and heavy attacks is solid. Refreshing, again, just like with the tank and healer, being able to use your abilities more often just means you could do more damage. You get more options, so Refreshing is always a nice perk to aim for. And then after that, it's anything that's just going to help you stay alive, friends. So Elemental Aversion is another one. Not as good as Enchanted Ward, but you could consider going for it. Slash Conditioning, Thrust Conditioning to make you take less damage. Health will increase your HP, so you don't die as often. There aren't really many perks that will increase your offensive damage in this build, so Refreshing, I guess, is the best example of that. The rest of the perks on your armor are just going to be defensive. When it comes to the weapon, again, anything that increases your crit chance, or your crit damage in particular, Vicious is very solid. Keenly Jagged, when you crit, you do more weapon damage. Perks that say you do more damage are very, very good for damage players. The Greatsword in particular, I think a must-have perk is Trenchant Strikes. So the most valuable perk to look for on your Greatsword is Trenchant Strikes. Heavy melee attacks deal 23% extra damage. This is a very, very good perk. This Greatsword in particular, one of the best in the game. It's likely still going to be the best by the time New World Aeternum comes out, and it comes from the PvP rewards track. So if you're a PvE or PvP, if you want to use the Greatsword, Serenity, still probably one of the best, assuming it hasn't got a nerf. You can get this again from the PvP rewards track, so focus on this if you want to be a Greatsword player. The Spear, Enfeebling Skewer is going to be the most important perk here, and then Vicious, Keenly Jagged, Keenly Empowered, Keen, Rogue. Generally perks that say you do more damage are what you want to be looking for on your damage weapons. One of the notable piece of gear that I want to point out is your ring. With the ring, you can get a damage perk here, so it'll be slash damage or thrust damage. I think I've got another ring over here, so yeah, we have... let me see, let me remind myself. Here we go, there's the comparison. So we can take a look at these two different rings here. The one on the left, the Azoth Crystal Ring, is giving us 7.1% extra slash damage, so that will benefit our Greatsword. The one on the right says we do 7.1% extra thrust damage, so the thrust damage is going to be great for that PvP build, as both the spear and the bow do thrusting damage. So getting thrust damage on your ring is going to be very beneficial. And then for PvE, the slash damage in particular for the Greatsword is going to benefit us quite a lot as well. One of the perks that I think works for all of these builds is just, it's called Keen Awareness, or Keen. You can see it here. 7% extra crit chance. Again, that is active for all weapons, so this could be an excellent all-rounder in terms of a ring perk, having Keen Awareness. So either prioritizing the slash damage, thrust damage, or Keen Awareness on the ring. And one of the perks that you really want to focus on is getting Hearty. That will give you the option, we talked about this with Healer, but it'll give you the option to dodge. Stamina is such an important resource in both PvE and PvP, so anything that increases your stamina is very, very good in New World Aeternum. And the Hearty perk on the ring, probably one of the most powerful perks in the game, so making sure you get that on your ring as soon as you can is going to help you out a lot, because we get the 1, 2, 3 dodge rolls. Going to increase our survivability in a huge fashion. Finally, one other important thing that I want to talk about as a damage player is your gems. Just like with the healer, where you can put a diamond in the life staff, or with a tank, where you can put the carnelian in the weapon, there are weapon or gems you can put in your weapons as a damage player that will increase your damage. An opal is one of the best examples, I would say. It says you do 12% more damage when your stamina is not full. This is the highest tier opal, but you will find lower tier opals as you level up. Putting those and socketing them into your weapon is just, again, after you dodge, you're just going to be doing more damage. As long as the stamina bar is not full, you will do more damage. And one of the cool things about the greatsword is, if we just go into our onslaught stance here, you can see that it says, heavy attacks charge 50% faster, but consume 10 stamina each. So that's the bottom line there, that quick charge. So if I go into onslaught mode, now whenever I do a heavy attack, it's going to be consuming stamina. So we have a way to permanently keep that opal online. So we're always under the max stamina, provided we stay in onslaught mode, which we will be able to do because we have that other passive here, charged onslaught. When it hits an enemy, you basically always stay in red mode, and therefore your opal is permanently online. So opal is a very, very good friend of the greatsword. Highly recommend you always go for opal in your greatsword, and honestly, it's solid in the spear as well. If you want some other alternative options, the diamond does increase your damage when you're full health, so if you have a good solid healer who can keep you topped up, that's great. And also the jasper might be one worth looking at as well. Jasper says you do extra damage when you take damage, so if you want to be a bit more of a aggressive frontline, what we would call a bruiser, where you're looking to trade blows with the enemy, jasper can be pretty good as well. But opal is going to be our go-to recommendation as a way just to eke out a little bit of extra damage in this build. But with that all said, I think this video has gone far longer than I wanted to, so we're going to wrap this one up here. If you want, like I say, more deep dives into each individual role, check out the videos we have on the channel. If you've been enjoying this New World Aeternum content so far, consider subscribing. We've got so many videos for New World Aeternum, and on top of that, I'm going to be streaming every day, so if you've got a question that you want to know, something in this video confused you, just hop into the live stream. I'll put a link to that in the description down below. And as always, friends, I'll catch you all in the next video.